The morning air in Willow Creek, Colorado, was crisp, carrying a sense of quiet serenity that blanketed the small suburban town. Emily Harris adjusted her scarf against the chill as she approached the familiar house of her best friend, Madison Walker. It wasn't like Madison to ignore calls or texts, especially after they had planned their usual Sunday brunch. Emily felt a flicker of unease as she noticed the front door slightly ajar, a detail Madison would never overlook. "Madison?" Emily called, her voice tentative as she pushed the door open. The house was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of a distant heater. Emily's heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor as she moved through the entrance, her heart sinking further with each step. The living room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air, subtle yet unmistakable. Then she saw her. Madison lay motionless on the rug, her figure unnaturally still, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something beyond her grasp. A glass of red wine, toppled on its side, had spilled across the cream-colored carpet, staining it like a crimson wound. Next to her body was a neatly folded piece of paper, placed with precision that felt deliberate. Emily's breath hitched. "Madison," she gasped, rushing forward. The cold, pale pallor of Madison's skin was unmistakable. She froze, a chill seeping into her veins as the reality of what she was seeing crashed down. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't natural. Her trembling fingers dialed 911. The police arrived swiftly, their presence a sharp contrast to the quiet desperation that had filled the house moments earlier. Among them was Detective Mark Reynolds, a man with sharp eyes that missed little. He moved with practiced efficiency, examining the scene with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen far too many tragedies. But as he scanned the room, something about the setup felt off. The note caught his attention. It was a simple, handwritten letter, signed with Madison's name, its contents appearing to be a farewell. But the more Reynolds studied it, the more the details gnawed at him. The handwriting was inconsistent, shaky in a way that suggested hesitation rather than sincerity. The position of Madison's body seemed almost too deliberate, as though someone had posed her. "This doesn't look like a suicide," Reynolds muttered under his breath, motioning for a forensic photographer to capture the scene. He noticed faint bruising around Madison's wrists, almost obscured by the long sleeves of her blouse. Something's not adding up. As the investigation began in earnest, Emily stood outside, wrapped in a blanket provided by one of the officers. Her mind churned with disbelief and grief, trying to comprehend how her vivacious, confident best friend could be gone. But the gnawing feeling in her gut suggested there was more to this than met the eye. 2 months earlier, the Harris family's life had seemed perfectly ordinary. Emily, a hardworking financial consultant, commuted to Denver most days, leaving her teenage son, Lucas, to his own devices. At 17, Lucas was a bright, handsome boy with a promising future, but he had grown increasingly withdrawn in recent months. Emily often chalked it up to typical teenage angst, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Madison had always been a fixture in their lives, a trusted confidant who often stepped in to help when Emily's demanding job pulled her away. Madison's presence in the Harris household was comforting, a second mother figure for Lucas, someone Emily never had to worry about. But beneath Madison's polished exterior lay a woman grappling with her own demons. The scars of her bitter divorce had left her feeling hollow, and though she hid it well, her loneliness gnawed at her. For Lucas, Madison was a revelation. She was everything his overworked mother couldn't be: attentive, engaging, and unabashedly supportive. At first, it was harmless, conversations about school, casual advice about life. But as Emily's work trips became more frequent, Lucas found himself lingering in Madison's orbit, seeking her company in a way that felt natural at first but quickly spiraled into something much darker. Madison, too, began to notice Lucas in a way she hadn't before. His youthful admiration was intoxicating, a balm to her wounded ego. The attention he gave her was flattering, even addictive, and she found herself encouraging it, subtly at first, a lingering smile, a touch on the arm. It was innocent, she told herself, but the boundaries blurred with alarming speed. For Lucas, those moments with Madison became the highlight of his days. He started to see her as more than a family friend. She was magnetic, a source of validation and affection he craved but never received from his emotionally distant mother. What began as admiration soon turned into obsession, and Lucas convinced himself that Madison was the missing piece in his life. Back in the present, Detective Reynolds flipped through Madison's phone records, his brow furrowing as he noted a pattern of late-night calls and texts exchanged with a single number, Lucas Harris. Reynolds felt the first stirrings of suspicion. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was something far more sinister. "Let's talk to the son," he instructed one of the officers. The hunt for answers was just beginning. 2 months before Madison Walker's tragic death, the Harris family's life seemed like any other in the quiet suburban town of Willow Creek. Emily Harris worked long hours as a financial consultant in Denver, often leaving her son, Lucas, alone after school. At 17, Lucas was intelligent and good-looking, but there was a certain fragility about him. His charm masked a deep loneliness that had taken root over years of feeling emotionally neglected. For Emily, balancing her demanding career with motherhood had always been a challenge. She loved Lucas deeply, but the long hours at the office often left her too drained to notice the subtle shifts in her son's behavior. She told herself that he was simply a typical teenager, navigating the turbulence of adolescence. She never imagined he might be seeking affection elsewhere. Madison Walker had always been more than a friend to Emily, she was practically family. They had been inseparable since college, sharing everything from heartbreaks to triumphs. In recent years, Madison had become Emily's go-to support system, often stepping in to help when work called Emily away. Madison, with her easy laugh and effortless charm, was someone Emily trusted implicitly. For Lucas, Madison had always been a warm, steady presence in his life. She was the person who remembered his favorite snacks, cheered at his school events, and offered advice with a sincerity that made him feel seen. At first, his admiration for Madison was harmless. She was an adult he respected and looked up to, a comforting counterbalance to his mother's absence. But everything began to change during one of Emily's frequent work trips in October 2022. Madison had agreed to keep an eye on Lucas while Emily attended a 3-day conference in Denver. Lucas had been struggling with a rough patch at school, an argument with a close friend, mounting academic pressure, and when Madison invited him over for dinner, he eagerly accepted. That evening, Lucas found himself opening up to Madison in ways he never could with his mother. Over homemade lasagna and a glass of soda, he confessed his frustrations about school, his feelings of isolation, and his struggles to connect with Emily. Madison listened attentively, her green eyes fixed on his as she nodded in understanding. She leaned across the table and placed a comforting hand on his. "You're so much more mature than most people your age, Lucas," she said with a smile that made his heart skip. "Your mom is lucky to have a son like you." It was a simple comment, meant to reassure, but for Lucas, it was a spark that ignited something deeper. For the first time, he felt truly understood, truly valued. That night, as he lay awake in bed replaying the conversation, Lucas began to see Madison not as his mother's best friend but as someone who could fill the void in his life. For Madison, the shift in their dynamic was subtle but undeniable. At 35, she was a woman who had learned to wear her pain well. Her divorce had left her emotionally bruised and yearning for validation. Though she was well-liked in Willow Creek for her outgoing personality and polished demeanor, Madison often felt an aching loneliness that her social circle couldn't ease. Lucas's admiration was like a balm to her wounded ego. She noticed the way his eyes lit up when she entered the room, the way he hung on her every word. It was intoxicating. At first, she told herself it was harmless, a boyhood crush that would fade with time. But the more attention Lucas gave her, the more Madison began to enjoy it. She started to invite Lucas over more often. They'd watch movies together, play board games, or simply talk for hours. Madison would compliment him on his intelligence, his humor, his potential. "You're going to do great things, Lucas," she'd say, her voice soft with encouragement. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Lucas soaked up her words like a sponge. Each compliment, each lingering glance, only deepened his attachment. For a boy starved of affection, Madison became a beacon of everything he had ever wanted. Her laughter, her warmth, her effortless confidence, she was magnetic, and Lucas was powerless to resist her pull. As the weeks passed, the boundaries between them began to blur. It started innocently enough, a casual hug that lingered a beat too long, a touch on the arm that sent a jolt through Lucas. Madison began to notice how Lucas's gaze would linger on her, the way he'd find excuses to be near her. And though a part of her recognized the danger, another part of her reveled in it. One evening, as they sat together on her couch, talking about Lucas's dreams for the future, Madison noticed the intensity in his eyes. He was looking at her not with the innocent admiration of a boy but with the yearning of a young man. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of the unspoken between them pressing like a heavy fog. But then she smiled and changed the subject, pretending not to notice. For Lucas, that moment solidified what he had been feeling. He was falling for Madison, and in his mind, she felt the same way. He convinced himself that the bond they shared was special, that she saw him as more than just a boy. It was a dangerous delusion, one Madison, whether intentionally or not, allowed to flourish. By November, their relationship had shifted into forbidden territory. Madison, lonely and craving excitement, began to flirt with Lucas in subtle, calculated ways. She'd brush her hand against his when passing a dish, compliment his appearance with a teasing smile. Lucas, emboldened by her attention, began to mirror her actions, finding excuses to touch her hand, lean closer when they talked. Madison told herself it was harmless, a fleeting thrill that wouldn't go anywhere. But deep down, she knew better. She could see the way Lucas's feelings for her were deepening, how his texts became more frequent, more intimate. "You're amazing," he'd write late at night. "I don't know what I'd do without you." And though Madison hesitated, she never told him to stop. The line between them was vanishing, and both were too far gone to turn back. By late November 2022, what began as an innocent connection between Madison and Lucas had morphed into something far more dangerous. The once clear boundaries that separated friendship and forbidden desire had completely dissolved. Their relationship now lived in stolen moments, whispered conversations, and an unspoken promise to keep their secret hidden from the world. Madison's home, nestled at the edge of Willow Creek, became the epicenter of their clandestine affair. The living room, with its cozy fireplace and soft, ambient lighting, seemed like a safe haven where they could exist outside the rules of society. Madison would pour herself a glass of wine, Lucas a soda, and they'd settle into the couch, the space between them growing smaller with each passing evening. At first, their encounters felt like harmless escapes, but they soon spiraled into something neither could fully control. Lucas, intoxicated by Madison's attention, began to crave her presence like an addiction. For him, she was more than a confidant, she was a lifeline, someone who made him feel seen and valued in a way his mother never had. Madison, meanwhile, found herself walking a dangerous line. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but she couldn't deny the thrill of Lucas's adoration. His youthful passion and vulnerability fed a part of her that had long been starved. She began to rationalize her actions, telling herself that she was offering Lucas comfort in a way his mother couldn't. But deep down, she knew the truth, she was playing with fire. Lucas's world began to revolve entirely around Madison. His grades, once impeccable, started to slip as he spent more time daydreaming about their next encounter. He withdrew from his friends, skipping social events and declining invitations, always coming up with excuses. To his peers, he seemed distracted, distant, even moody. But none of them knew the truth. At home, Lucas grew increasingly secretive. He'd stay in his room for hours, texting Madison under the guise of studying. When Emily would ask how his day went, his answers were curt, his demeanor cold. "Fine," he'd say, avoiding eye contact. If she pressed further, he'd snap, retreating upstairs before she could dig any deeper. Emily began to notice the growing chasm between them. Lucas had always been reserved, but now there was a tension in his behavior that she couldn't ignore. He avoided her questions, grew irritable at the slightest provocation, and seemed to be hiding something. Emily's instinct told her that something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Madison, too, felt the strain of their secret. To the outside world, she was the same confident, composed woman everyone admired. She attended social gatherings, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, and maintained her role as Emily's best friend. But behind closed doors, she lived with a gnawing anxiety that their affair would be discovered. Every time Emily praised her for looking out for Lucas, Madison felt a pang of guilt. She'd laugh it off, saying, "Oh, he's a great kid. It's no trouble at all," even as she knew she was betraying the trust of the one person who had always been there for her. The guilt was compounded by Lucas's growing dependence. His late-night texts became more intense, filled with declarations of love and longing that Madison wasn't prepared to handle. "You're the only one who understands me," he'd write. "I don't know what I'd do without you." While Madison tried to maintain some semblance of control, Lucas's intensity began to overwhelm her. She started to avoid his texts during the day, claiming she was busy, but she couldn't bring herself to sever their connection entirely. A part of her craved his attention, even as another part of her dreaded what might happen if things continued to escalate. At the Harris household, Emily's unease continued to grow. She couldn't ignore the way Lucas avoided her or the way he seemed to come alive whenever Madison was around. During dinner one evening, she brought up Lucas's recent withdrawal. "You've been spending a lot of time at Madison's," she said casually, hoping to gauge his reaction. Lucas froze, his fork hovering mid-air. "She's just helping me with some school stuff," he replied, too quickly, his voice defensive. Emily studied him for a moment, noting the faint flush creeping up his neck. Something wasn't adding up, but Madison's reassuring presence had always been a constant in her life. She pushed the thought aside, unwilling to entertain the possibility that her best friend could be anything but trustworthy. Despite their best efforts to keep their secret, the pressure of their double lives began to take its toll. Madison grew increasingly irritable, snapping at Lucas when he pushed for more time together. "We have to be careful," she'd say, her tone sharp, though her hands trembled as she adjusted her bracelet. Lucas, feeling rejected, began to spiral. He couldn't understand why Madison seemed to be pulling away, and his desperation only made him cling harder. He started showing up unannounced at her house, pleading for just a few minutes of her time. "Lucas, you can't keep doing this," Madison warned during one such encounter. "If anyone finds out." "No one's going to find out," Lucas interrupted, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." Madison didn't respond, her silence cutting through the air like a blade. At home, Emily's patience was wearing thin. The distance between her and Lucas had grown into a chasm, and every attempt to bridge it was met with resistance. One night, as she passed his room, she overheard him arguing on the phone. His voice was low, urgent, and filled with a frustration she couldn't ignore. "Why are you acting like this?" Lucas hissed, his tone raw with emotion. "You're the one who said this was special." Emily froze, her hand resting on the doorframe. She wanted to burst in, demand answers, but something held her back, a fear of what she might uncover. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the unthinkable, that whatever Lucas was hiding, it was far darker than she had imagined. The tension had reached a boiling point. The walls of secrecy surrounding Madison and Lucas's relationship were beginning to crack, and the ripple effects were threatening to tear the Harris family apart. But the storm that loomed on the horizon would be far worse than any of them could have anticipated. By mid-December 2022, the fragile web of lies surrounding Lucas Harris and Madison Walker's secret relationship was fraying at the edges. Madison, overwhelmed by guilt and the growing intensity of Lucas's obsession, began to realize the devastating consequences if their secret were ever exposed. For Lucas, however, the thought of losing Madison was unbearable. What had started as a forbidden connection had become an all-consuming fixation. On the evening of December 14th, Madison sat in her dimly lit living room, her thoughts racing as she stared at the flickering flames in her fireplace. The weight of her actions pressed down on her chest like an unbearable burden. She thought of Emily, her oldest and dearest friend, and the betrayal she had so carefully hidden. The guilt, once an occasional pang, had grown into a constant ache. Every text from Lucas, every stolen moment, felt like another step toward disaster. She knew she couldn't keep this up. It was wrong. Dangerous. And now, Lucas was beginning to ask for more than she could give. Madison picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed out a message to Lucas. "We need to talk. Come over tomorrow after school." She hesitated before hitting send, knowing the words would devastate him. But it had to be done. She couldn't keep letting this spiral out of control. The next afternoon, Lucas arrived at Madison's house, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The December air was sharp and cold, but Lucas barely felt it. His mind was consumed with thoughts of what Madison wanted to say. When she opened the door, her expression was guarded, her usual warm smile replaced by a strained neutrality. She stepped aside to let him in, and Lucas followed, his nerves tightening as he noticed the uncharacteristic tension in her demeanor. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them feeling like an insurmountable chasm. Madison was the first to speak, her voice calm but firm. "Lucas," she began, choosing her words carefully, "we can't keep doing this. It's not right. It's not healthy, for either of us." Lucas's brow furrowed in confusion, then anger. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "You said this was special. You said you cared about me." "I do care about you," Madison replied, her tone softening for a moment. "But this, it has to stop. If we keep going, it's going to destroy both of us." Her words hit Lucas like a physical blow. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as the enormity of what she was saying sank in. "You're just going to throw me away?" he asked, his voice trembling. "After everything, you're just done with me?" Madison looked away, guilt flickering across her face. "Lucas, I never meant for this to go as far as it did. I made a mistake. I'm sorry." The apology was like gasoline on a fire. Lucas shot to his feet, pacing the room with a mixture of anger and desperation. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice rising. "You said you needed me. You said I was the only one who understood you. And now I'm just a mistake? Keep your voice down." Madison hissed, glancing nervously toward the windows. She stood, trying to calm him, but Lucas stepped back, his movements agitated. "You don't get to do this to me," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't get to just walk away like I don't matter." Madison's patience snapped. "Lucas, you're acting like a child," she said, her voice sharp. "This isn't love. It's obsession. You need to grow up and face reality." The words were a knife to Lucas's chest. His vision blurred with a mix of tears and fury as he shouted back, "You don't get to tell me how I feel. You're the one who started this." The argument spiraled, their voices overlapping as accusations and pleas filled the air. Madison tried to take control, reaching for Lucas's arm to calm him, but he yanked away, his emotions boiling over into a storm he couldn't contain. In the chaos, Lucas's desperation turned physical. He grabbed Madison by the shoulders, shaking her as he pleaded, "Don't do this. Don't leave me." Madison struggled, her voice rising in panic. "Lucas, stop. Let go of me." The struggle became a blur of movement and raw emotion. In a moment of blind fury and anguish, Lucas shoved Madison backward. She stumbled, her head striking the edge of the coffee table with a sickening thud. The room fell silent. Lucas froze, staring in horror as Madison lay motionless on the floor. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as the reality of what had just happened hit him like a tidal wave. He dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulder. "Madison," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Madison, wake up." But she didn't move. Panic surged through Lucas like ice in his veins. His mind raced as he tried to process what to do. He couldn't call for help. He couldn't let anyone find out what had happened. His hands trembled as he surveyed the scene, his thoughts darting to one inevitable conclusion: he had to make it look like an accident. Or a suicide. Lucas worked frantically, dragging Madison's limp body to the couch and arranging her in what he thought looked like a natural position. He found a piece of paper in her kitchen drawer, scrawling a short, shaky note that read like a farewell. His handwriting was uneven, his mind too frenzied to replicate hers. He placed the note beside her, grabbed his phone, and wiped away the few texts they'd exchanged that day. By the time he stepped outside into the cold December air, he felt like he could barely breathe. As Lucas walked away from Madison's house, the weight of what he'd done pressed heavily on his chest. He told himself it had been an accident, a moment of anger gone too far. But deep down, he knew that what had happened was irreversible. The house loomed behind him like a shadow, a silent witness to the chaos and tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The following morning, December 16, 2022, Willow Creek was blanketed in a pale winter fog. Detective Mark Reynolds arrived at Madison Walker's house shortly after receiving the call. As he stepped through the threshold, the faint scent of red wine and the sterile chill of an unheated room greeted him. The scene before him was haunting. Madison's lifeless body reclined on the couch, a handwritten note placed neatly on the coffee table beside an empty wine glass. To a casual observer, it looked like a tragic suicide. But Mark Reynolds was not a casual observer. Reynolds crouched beside the coffee table, his sharp eyes scanning the details. The note, supposedly written by Madison, struck him as odd. Though it contained the hallmarks of a goodbye letter, the handwriting was inconsistent. Some letters were shakier than others, as if written in haste or by an unfamiliar hand. The positioning of Madison's body also felt staged. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, and her hands rested too neatly in her lap. Reynolds's experience with similar cases told him that suicide scenes were rarely this clean, this deliberate. He turned to the forensic photographer. "Get a close-up of her wrists," he instructed, his voice low. When the photos came back, his suspicions deepened. There were faint bruises encircling Madison's wrists, subtle but undeniable signs of a struggle. Reynolds's gaze hardened as he stood and took in the room once more. Something about this wasn't adding up. As the forensic team combed through the house, Reynolds turned his attention to Madison's phone, a gold-plated device lying on the kitchen counter. Unlocking it with the help of the department's tech specialist, he scrolled through her recent texts and call logs. One name stood out immediately: Lucas Harris. The logs revealed a pattern: frequent, late-night messages exchanged over the past 2 months, many of them within hours of Madison's death. Reynolds furrowed his brow as he read a string of texts from the day before. "Lucas, you promised we'd talk. I'm coming over. Madison, we'll talk, but this needs to stop." Reynolds's instincts flared. Madison's relationship with Lucas was clearly more than casual, and whatever they had been discussing appeared to have escalated in the hours leading up to her death. Later that day, Reynolds paid a visit to the Harris household. Emily answered the door, her face pale and tear-streaked. She had been devastated by the news of Madison's death, unable to comprehend how her vibrant, charismatic best friend could have taken her own life. "Detective Reynolds," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Please, tell me you found something. This doesn't make any sense." "We're still investigating," Reynolds replied carefully, his gaze flickering toward the stairs where Lucas's room was. "I'd like to speak with Lucas if he's available." Emily hesitated, her brow creasing. "He's been distant since we heard the news. I think it's hit him hard. Madison was like family to him." When she called Lucas downstairs, his demeanor was immediately suspicious. The once charming teenager now looked haggard, his eyes darting nervously as he approached. Reynolds noticed the way Lucas avoided looking directly at him, the way he lingered near the edge of the room as if ready to flee. "Lucas," Reynolds began, his tone measured, "I understand you were close to Madison. When was the last time you saw her?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "A few days ago," he said quickly. "I haven't talked to her since." Reynolds nodded but made no effort to hide his skepticism. "We've found some messages between the two of you," he continued. "It seems you were planning to meet yesterday." Lucas's face flushed. Yeah, I texted her, but she said she was busy," he stammered. "I didn't go over there." Reynolds didn't press further, but the boy's erratic answers only confirmed what he already suspected: Lucas was hiding something. The next day, Reynolds received a crucial piece of evidence, footage from a neighbor's security camera, which captured part of the street outside Madison's house. At 7:15 p.m. on December 15th, a figure resembling Lucas could be seen walking up to Madison's door. At 9:02 p.m., the same figure left, their movements hurried and erratic. Reynolds played the video over and over, his suspicion hardening into certainty. Combined with the messages, the staged scene, and Lucas's behavior, the evidence painted a damning picture. Reynolds returned to the Harris home that evening, armed with a warrant to bring Lucas in for questioning. Emily protested, her voice trembling with disbelief. "This is absurd. Lucas would never hurt Madison," she exclaimed. Reynolds met her gaze with quiet resolve. "Mrs. Harris, I understand this is difficult to hear, but the evidence suggests otherwise. We need to hear his side of the story." Lucas was silent as officers escorted him to the station. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he sat in the interrogation room. Reynolds watched him from the other side of the glass, his expression unreadable. When the questioning began, Lucas tried to hold firm, repeating his earlier story about not seeing Madison that night. But as Reynolds laid out the evidence, the texts, the security footage, the inconsistencies in his alibi, Lucas's composure began to crumble. "I didn't mean to hurt her." Lucas finally burst out, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. "It was an accident." Reynolds leaned forward, his voice steady but unrelenting. "Tell me what happened, Lucas." The teenager sobbed as he recounted the events of that night, how Madison had told him their relationship needed to end, how he had begged her not to leave him, and how their argument had spiraled out of control. "I didn't mean to push her," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She fell, and she hit her head. I didn't know what to do. I panicked." As Reynolds listened, a heavy silence filled the room. The truth was finally out, but it brought no relief, only the grim reality of a young life shattered by obsession and a tragedy that could never be undone. The investigation had uncovered the dark, tangled web that led to Madison Walker's death. But as Lucas sat alone in the interrogation room, his head in his hands, one question lingered in Reynolds's mind: how had it come to this? The interrogation room was silent except for the sound of Lucas Harris's uneven breathing. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of his guilt was physically pressing him into the chair. Detective Mark Reynolds sat across from him, his eyes steady but devoid of triumph. The room felt cold, clinical, a sharp contrast to the emotional chaos swirling inside the teenage boy. "You've told me part of the truth, Lucas," Reynolds said, his voice calm but firm. "But I need all of it. I need to understand what happened that night." Lucas wiped at his face with trembling hands. The tears kept coming, a torrent of emotion that he couldn't stop. His lips quivered as he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted to end it," Lucas began, his words tumbling out in fragmented sentences. She said it was a mistake, that it had gone too far. But it wasn't a mistake to me. It was everything." He paused, his breath hitching. Reynolds gave him space, watching as Lucas wrestled with the memory. "I went to her house to talk. I just wanted her to listen, to see how much I cared about her. But she told me it was over. That we couldn't see each other anymore." His voice cracked, and he clenched his fists as if trying to hold himself together. "She said I was being a child. That I didn't understand what I was doing." Reynolds's gaze didn't waver. "And how did you respond?" Lucas's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I begged her to change her mind. I told her I couldn't lose her. But she wouldn't listen. She told me to leave." His voice grew softer, as though he were shrinking into himself. "I couldn't take it. I got angry. I grabbed her. I just wanted her to stay, to talk to me." "What happened next, Lucas?" Reynolds prompted gently. Lucas hesitated, his face contorting with pain. "She tried to push me away. She told me to let go. And then I shoved her." He closed his eyes as the memory flooded back. "She fell backward. She hit her head on the table. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, I didn't mean for it." Reynolds let the silence linger, allowing Lucas to sit with the weight of his words. The boy's confession had been inevitable, but the truth was no less devastating. "What did you do after she fell?" Reynolds asked, his tone even. Lucas looked down at his hands, his voice barely audible. "She wasn't moving. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I thought if anyone found out, they'd think I killed her on purpose." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "So I tried to make it look like a suicide. I wrote the note, cleaned up the wine glass. I thought it would be enough." His words trailed off into a hollow silence, the enormity of his actions settling in the air between them. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his expression somber. "Lucas, this wasn't just a mistake. You made choices that have consequences. Do you understand that?" Lucas nodded weakly, his face crumpling under the weight of his guilt. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice breaking. I didn't want to lose her." By the time Lucas was escorted out of the station in handcuffs, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the town of Willow Creek in a deep, somber twilight. Emily Harris stood outside the police station, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had arrived the moment she received the call from Detective Reynolds, unable to believe the words she had heard. "Your son has confessed to being involved in Madison Walker's death." As Lucas emerged, his eyes met Emily's, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to freeze. The woman who had brought him into the world, who had loved and cared for him despite her imperfections, now looked at him with a mixture of heartbreak and disbelief. "Mom," Lucas started, his voice trembling. But Emily couldn't find the words. Her hands covered her mouth, her body shaking with sobs as she watched the officers lead her son away. She had lost not only her best friend but the boy she thought she knew. In the days that followed, the town of Willow Creek was rocked by the revelation surrounding Madison Walker's death. News of Lucas's confession spread quickly, and the media descended upon the once quiet community, turning the tragedy into a spectacle. Neighbors whispered, reporters camped outside the Harris home, and Emily found herself isolated in a sea of judgment and pity. At school, Lucas's classmates struggled to reconcile the boy they thought they knew with the young man who now stood accused of such a heinous act. Some spoke of the subtle changes they'd noticed in him, his withdrawal, his mood swings, but none had imagined the darkness lurking beneath the surface. Lucas's trial began in early 2023, a grim affair that laid bare the toxic relationship between him and Madison. Prosecutors painted Madison as a manipulative woman who had taken advantage of Lucas's vulnerability, while the defense argued that Lucas's actions were the result of emotional immaturity and a lack of guidance. For Emily, sitting in the courtroom was a surreal and excruciating experience. She listened as lawyers dissected her son's life, as witnesses recounted the secrets he had kept hidden. The woman who had once prided herself on her ability to provide for her son now felt as though she had failed him in the most fundamental way. In the end, Lucas was convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to a lengthy prison term that would steal away the prime years of his life. As the gavel fell, sealing his fate, Lucas felt the last vestiges of hope drain from his body. The boy who had once dreamed of a bright future now faced the stark reality of a life defined by his mistakes. Back at the Harris home, Emily tried to piece together the fragments of her shattered life. The loss of Madison, the betrayal of her trust, and the absence of her son left an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. She replayed the past in her mind, searching for the signs she had missed, the moments she could have intervened. But the truth was undeniable. She had lost both Madison and Lucas to a tragedy of her own blind spots. The confession had brought closure to the case, but for Emily and Lucas, it marked the beginning of a lifelong sentence, one defined not by bars and chains, but by the haunting echoes of a single, irrevocable night. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, but the ripples of Madison Walker's death and Lucas Harris's confession continued to echo through the small town of Willow Creek. For Emily Harris, life had become a quiet, haunting shadow of what it once was. The vibrant home she had worked so hard to build now felt hollow, every corner a reminder of the son who was no longer there and the friend she would never see again. Emily spent her days lost in thought, trying to piece together the signs she had missed. She replayed every conversation with Madison, every distant moment with Lucas, searching for a point where she could have intervened. How had it come to this? She had always prided herself on being a capable, attentive mother, but now she wondered if her career-driven choices had created the void Lucas sought to fill. Her nights were the hardest. The silence was deafening, the absence of Lucas's presence a constant ache in her chest. She often found herself sitting in his room, running her fingers over the photographs on his desk, the trophies on his shelf. Each object was a reminder of the boy he had been, the boy she still loved, despite everything. For Lucas, life behind bars was a harsh awakening. The walls of his cell were a stark contrast to the warmth of Madison's living room, where he had once believed he'd found the love he so desperately craved. Now, he spent his days consumed by guilt, the memory of that fateful night playing on a relentless loop in his mind. He wrote letters to Emily, apologizing over and over, though he could never bring himself to send them. What could he possibly say to her? How could he ask for forgiveness when he couldn't even forgive himself? Madison's face haunted him in every dream, her voice echoing in his thoughts. "You're acting like a child," she had said. And perhaps she had been right. His obsession, his inability to let go, had destroyed everything. Willow Creek, once a quiet and tight-knit community, had become a place defined by whispers and judgment. The Harris family, once respected and admired, now lived under a cloud of scandal. Neighbors avoided Emily at the grocery store, their pitying glances cutting deeper than any words could. But not everyone was quick to judge. Some saw Lucas as a victim, of Madison's manipulation, of his own immaturity, of a system that failed to notice the cracks before they became chasms. Others viewed him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how unchecked emotions and fractured relationships could lead to ruin. As the months passed, Emily began to seek solace in therapy. At first, it felt unnatural, even painful, to talk about the events that had shattered her life. But gradually, she found herself opening up, peeling back the layers of guilt and grief that had consumed her. Through her sessions, Emily began to see the tragedy not just as a failure, but as a series of missed opportunities, moments where communication, attention, and understanding might have made all the difference. She couldn't change the past, but she resolved to use the lessons it had taught her to rebuild her life and honor both Madison and Lucas in her own way. One day, Emily received a letter from Lucas. The envelope, smudged with ink and folded at the edges, bore his familiar handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Mom," the letter began. "I know I've said this before, but I need you to hear it again. I'm sorry. For everything. For what I did to Madison, to you, to our family. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even think I deserve it. But I want you to know that I think about you every day. About how much I miss you, and how much I wish I could take it all back. I hope one day I can make it up to you, even if I know I never really can. I love you. Lucas." Emily clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't undo the past, but she could choose how to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. The story of Madison, Lucas, and Emily serves as a grim reminder of the consequences of fractured relationships, unchecked emotions, and secrets too heavy to bear. It is a tale of love, obsession, betrayal, and redemption, showing how the choices we make can ripple through the lives of those around us in ways we might never fully understand. What do you think of this story? Could Emily have done anything to prevent this tragedy? Do you think Lucas deserves a second chance, or are his actions unforgivable? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions, questions, and reflections in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one, stories that make us think, question, and feel. Your voice matters, so let us know, what would you have done if you were in Emily's shoes?